Hi, and welcome to the Headstart Week Notemaking tutorial. This tutorial is designed to give you some ideas about what notemaking style is going to be best for you as you embark on university study. So we'll cover, first of all, the difference between notemaking and note-taking. We'll also think about the differences between lectures and seminars and how notemaking can play a role in that. And finally, I'm going to give you some different examples of note-making styles so you can take them away and try them out yourself. So first off, you need to think about the fact that there's going to be different situations in which you need to make notes at university. Obviously, you're going to have lectures and seminars when you'll be listening and needing to pay attention to what someone else is saying while also taking down notes, which can be quite difficult. But there are other instances in which you'll have to do this as well. For example, you might want to take notes during a meeting with a personal tutor. You might, or other types of meetings, organizational meetings, student volunteering activities meetings, those sorts of things. So there's lots of different ways in which note-making can be beneficial to you. And then of course you'll also need to be making notes when you're reading. So that's a little bit easier because at least you control the speed with that. But you have to kind of just be aware that there's different situations in which you'll need to make notes, and you can adjust to that to be most effective. So the difference between note-taking and note-making. Take refers to a more passive process, right? You are just sitting back and receiving information and copying down whatever you hear. It's not the most useful way to think about the note-making process. Make suggests an active process. It suggests that you are participating and helping to create some knowledge through that. So we try to emphasize that note-making is what you want to be doing. You want to be actively engaged in creating the material that you're going to use to revise later. So you're going to encounter different situations when you're in lectures and when you're in seminars. Lectures are generally very, very large groups, and it's much less active for you. Somebody will stand at the front of the room and provide you with information. So it's very important that you stay engaged yourself because no one else is going to be watching you to make sure you do that. Seminars are a little bit more personal, and they tend to be smaller groups, and the emphasis is a lot more on you participating actively. So you need to kind of be prepared for the difference between those two and the fact that your note-making style might change depending on which situation you're in. So some of the things that you might find difficult with note-making are, for one thing, when you go to lectures, the content might be totally new to you. You can minimize that by doing the recommended or required reading, but you might still be trying to parse out ideas at the same time as you're trying to take them down, and that can be tricky. It can also just be hard to balance between following what the lecturer is saying and also making notes on it. You can get too invested in one or the other and miss out on important information or miss out on recording it. And then similar to that is it can be difficult to decide what the most important information is, and part of that again is making sure it's an active process. As long as you're participating in that process, you're going to be better about figuring out what information you need to take down. And finally, in seminars, a different kind of balancing can happen because you need to be participating in that discussion as well as somehow taking notes. And seminars are much more free-flowing, it's more of a conversation, and so making notes in there can be particularly difficult. At least in lectures, they tend to be quite ordered. You might even have an outline from the lecturer, so it's easier to follow and figure out what to make notes on. So those are all some of the difficulties you might encounter. So how to make the most of both lectures and seminars. The number one thing that you can do to do this is to come prepared. And I don't just mean doing the required reading or preparing any assignments that you're assigned, but actively thinking ahead to the lecture or seminar you're going to be attending by, for example, writing down some questions, say based on the reading from the previous night. So if you arrive with some set questions you'd like to ask, even if you're not actually going to ask them aloud, it gives you something to be looking for, right? So if there's a list of 5 things you didn't understand from the reading, and you write those down, then at least you know you're looking for answers from that lecturer as he or she is talking. It makes it more active for you, and it makes you think through the different topics that you're going to be covering in a much more active way. So think about that. You can also try using an audio recorder to record lectures, but if you do that, you need to speak to the lecturer first to make sure it's okay with them. It's considered very rude if you try to record a lecture without asking permission. Most of them will not mind at all, but they do appreciate that you ask first. Leave a lot of space around the notes you do make so that you can go back either within the lecture or afterwards, and add things in or change things around if necessary. You'll find that you want to edit your notes eventually, so leave a lot of space between lines and in the margins. And try not to get too bogged down in trying to write everything down. Remember that it is about your understanding, so you do want to listen and try to keep the notes to a minimum. And remember, you can always go back later for clarification, either to the tutor or to your lecture notes, to the lecturer's notes, or you link slides, whatever. And finally, have a standardized note-making method. We're going to go over some of your options in a minute, and try to develop something early on. Don't just coast by for the first half of the year and then suddenly realize you don't have a set method, because you are creating the materials you're going to use at the end of the year when it comes to revision. So you want to set up some sort of system, and a system that works for you, as early as possible. Now, this is an example of one of the kinds of note-making styles you might use. It's just called linear note-making, and I think it's particularly good for when you've done reading, and it can work in lectures as well because it's fairly detailed. The one problem with it is you can end up writing too much down. But for example, this is a bit of note-making on some reading. So at the very top, you have the reference, the full reference of whatever was read, and you should get into that habit. If you are doing a lot of reading, always put the reference at the top so you never come into the problem of wondering where you got a piece of information. It will come back to haunt you if you don't. I also like to put a paragraph at the very top of my linear notes where I've just written down my general reaction to what I've read and everything I remember. I think that tends to be a lot more useful than the detailed notes that I take. So that's useful. And then you can see the notes from the chapter that was read have been broken down into sections and using bullet points. So you can develop your own system with that, but it's essentially writing an outline of what you've read or what you're listening to. Again, the pitfall can be that you tend to write too much with this method. A different method that you might consider is what's known as the Cornell method. And this was so called because it was developed by Cornell University in the United States. And it basically just looks like this. This is really useful for in-lecture or in-seminar note-making when you really need to minimize what you're writing so that you can spend time listening as well. And all it is you draw a line down about a third of the way across the page and another line along the bottom, and you split it into cues, notes, and summary. And cues are things like your keywords, your really big ideas, your main points, little diagrams, anything that's going to help you to prompt you to think about other things when you're studying. And then the notes are the slightly more detailed bits of information about those keywords. It's a really good way of forcing yourself to think about the big overall ideas in a lecture. The summary is what really makes this an active method, because that's actually what you do after class. You don't stop working the second the lecture ends. You sit down and you think, okay, what are the major ideas that I took away from this? And you summarize it for yourself. That will stick in your head much better than pages of notes would. So really useful method that I would recommend trying out. And then finally we have what's called mind mapping. This is a much more creative and visual style, and if you are a visual person, you might find this really useful. It's not very good to try in lectures because you might find it's a bit too hard to follow. Some people may be able to do it, but it can be a really useful way also of just figuring out your ideas for brainstorming, how to structure an essay. You start in the middle with, and it doesn't have to be this colorful or this much, art involved, but you start in the middle with a major idea, and then you just bring different points off of that idea and keep breaking them down. And you'll find it's a really useful brainstorming tool as well. So it's worth giving a try to see if it's the kind of style that would work for you. So our top tips for note making. The best notes are your responses to the material or what you're hearing, not just what it says or what the person is saying. So write down questions you have as you read or as you listen. Write down any time where you think, I don't know if I agree with that. You want to interrogate that. You want to ask why you don't agree. So your best notes are actually your active responses to the text or the person. And then similar to that is you want to make sure you note down anything that you would like to investigate further. It might be that you just draw a little star next to it or circle it with a highlighter, whatever. But don't let those things fade away because they could lead to essay topics, to answers on exams. Those are the ideas you're interested in, so you want to make sure you point those out to yourself for later use. Be thinking about things like keywords, thinking about ways of highlighting the important bits. Again, highlighters, you might use different colored pens, lots of different things you could do to make sure you're making the most use of those notes at a later date. And finally, come up with a system early. Try the different ways that I've just enumerated for you. Figure out what works for you, and then stick with it. And try to have a really solid, collection of notes that you are going to use for revision at the end of the year. Don't wait until it's too late to do that, because revision will be so much more difficult if you do. And finally, know your resources. Visit the Ask website for details on our drop-in times as well as our workshop timetable. And you should also check out our Blackboard Learn section for resources on all aspects of academic skills, maths, numeracy, statistics, writing, and so on. Thanks very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial.